Episode 41, Part 04, Chapter 41. Chapter 41. Gold Saucer. Moods lifted once the air cab came to life and slid out of Ropeway Station, carried up into the air by the long cables they had seen on the ridge, taking them towards the Gold Saucer theme park. Eris and Tifa both pressed themselves against the windows and looked out as the land gradually fell further away from them and swept past. Land that they knew they would eventually have to walk across in order to head further south. Looking ahead, they could see the mountain range spreading further south, and a vast forest separated from them by yet another river they would have to cross. They were distracted from their map plotting when a large patch of yellow suddenly swept its way beneath them and made them look down. The green grass that lined the floor rapidly faded as yellow sand replaced it, swamping the grass and choking it out till nothing but sand remained. Unfortunately, the sand did not belong to a beautiful beach like Costa del Solution. It belonged to a vast desert that stretched across the entire area. Tifa remembered reading about the desert in the Midgar Times. An entire squad of Shinra soldiers had entered the desert and sank in quicksand. The desert was full of them, and no one knew just how deep they ran. She certainly didn't want to get lost in there without some form of transportation. Lifting her gaze away from the sand and looking ahead, she quickly spotted the gold saucer. They had only seen it from a distance before outside the perimeter of Costa del Sol, but now it was rapidly coming up close into a perfect view. Even Yuffie was forced to break out of the silent mood she had been in since they set off and look out of the windows to see it. It was not a disappointment. The gold saucer looked absolutely spectacular from above, and it would look even better at night. Up close it still looked like a giant gold flower with giant leaves, possibly even taller than Shinra headquarters back in Midgar. Brightly colored lights shone out from almost every leaf, shining through the air and reflecting off the gold plating that covered the entire building. Sliding open the air cab window, the sound of carnival music hit their ears, festive and happy. They looked down as they passed near one of the giant leaves, where a roller coaster sped past. They only briefly saw the people there, hearing their joyful screams for only a split second before they sped off back into the park. Eris could barely contain her excitement and jumped up happily, grabbing hold of Yuffie's arm and pulling her round to see the roller coaster before it disappeared, for they were already beginning to descend to their departure point. They landed on the very bottom leaf of the theme park, entering a small tunnel that turned dark as they reached the entrance. The sound of the music became louder as they entered, and after a second too they emerged from the dark tunnel and out into the light again, this time inside the park. Eris was the first to jump out of the air cab and look around. She saw the tunnel that they had come out of, and saw that it was shaped like the head of a Mog, and that they had come out of its mouth. Turning around she saw a man walking nearby, also dressed like a big, fat, cuddly chick. The man spotted her looking at him, and did a fancy little bow. "Welcome to the Gold Saucer," he said cheerfully. Eris beamed. Other people she had met dressed in mascot outfits were usually very grumpy, having to force a cheerful smile and a cheerful tone when they spoke. This man did not sound at all unhappy. The others came out of the air cab then after saying farewell to the driver, and together they headed towards the entrance leading right into the park. There was a woman, clearly one of the park's staff, waiting for them as they approached. "Welcome to the Gold Saucer," she announced to the group, sounding just as genuinely cheerful as the Mog man. "Are you together? A single pass is 3,000 gil, or you can purchase a lifetime pass for 30,000 gil. Cloud turned to the others. A lifetime pass to the Gold Saucer would grant them entry anytime they liked without ever paying again. The other advantage to the lifetime pass is that it applied to all the members of a particular group, and not just one specific person. The question was, did they have 30,000 gil? Slowly but surely, the others began to empty their pockets. Everyone except Red 13 and Yuffie, that is. Red 13 had nothing to carry money in, and Yuffie just watched with interest as they emptied their pockets. Tifa managed to fish out 3,000 gil from the pocket of her skirt, and Eris pulled out 1,500. Barrett pulled out an impressive 7,000 gil that he had kept on him from the Avalanche savings. The only money Cloud had was whatever he picked up from his own jobs, the only recent ones being those he had done for Avalanche. So he threw his 3,500 gil onto the floor along with the others. "That makes 15,000 gil exactly," said Tifa after she quickly counted it. "That's enough for 5 single passes, but there are 6 of us." Eris sagged heavily. "That means one of us will have to wait," she said. "Not necessarily," said Red 13 suddenly. Everyone looked up at him curiously, wondering what he meant. "There is still one person who has yet to empty their pockets." He slowly turned his head to the left, where Yuffie was kneeling. One by one the others caught and turned their gazes to Yuffie. The young hunter blinked several times before she realized what they were waiting for.
No way!
She exclaimed, shaking her head furiously.
My cash is my cash. I earned it.
Stole it, most like, said Barrett angrily. He stood up and pointed his gun arm at the girl.
Empty your pockets already.
Yuffie spun around and tried to run, but the moment she turned, Tifa, who had quickly moved behind her to prevent the girl's escape, caught her. Tifa grabbed the girl roughly by her arms and lifted her up, turning the girl until she was upside down, her legs kicking wildly in the air like an out-of-control wildcat, and gently shook her. As Tifa shook the girl, things began to fall from the girl's pockets and clatter onto the floor. Gil, items, and even the materia that she had so clearly stolen from Costa del Sol, they all clattered onto the floor in front of them. Cloud particularly noticed the familiar red ball of materia that Priscilla had given him back in Junon. The sneaky hunter had clearly swiped it when Cloud hadn't noticed. He ignored that for the moment, for the most important thing was counting the gil that she had, and she clearly had a lot of it.
1,000. 3,000. 7,000.
Cloud whispered under his breath, counting it up. Tifa finally put the girl down as he counted, but kept a hand on her wrist to stop her from taking it back. Eventually Cloud finished his counting, and looked up.
15,000 gil exactly. Are you sure this is all yours? Of course it is.
Spat the girl.
Besides, that guy in the stall wasn't going to use it, so I claimed it.
Cloud shook his head, and picked up all the money laid out on the floor.
Well, in any case,
he said.
We have 30,000 gil.
The others all nodded their heads anxiously, wondering just how much of Yuffie's money she had actually stolen, or how much of it actually belonged to them. Cloud was thinking the same, but he turned back to the woman, who was waiting for them. He handed the full 30,000 gil to her, and she smiled.
Thank you very much,
she said. She pulled out a gold ticket from her pocket and handed it to Cloud.
If you have a gold ticket, you can come and go freely into the park. As long as you don't lose it. Here at the Gold Saucer, there are many places where you must pay with GP. Just think of GP as money that you can only use at the Gold Saucer. GP can be redeemed at the games in the Wonder Square and at the Chocobo races. Your GP limit is 10,000, so please be careful. Please enjoy yourselves.
She then stepped aside from the door, allowing the group entrance into the park. The group went in, Yuffie sauntering slowly at the back of the group, back in a sulk now that all her cash had been taken from her. Even the Shiva materia had been taken back from her. The main station of the Gold Saucer was a very plain entry point. It was circular-shaped, with a number of wide holes bordering the edges, each with a sign above it. In the Gold Saucer, the only way to get from section to section was through those special tubes that carried them safely from place to place. Eris ran into the station first and went straight to the map at the head of the room.
Wow!
She exclaimed cheerfully, looking at all the wonderful attractions available in the park.
Let's have fun!
She turned towards the others behind her.
I know this isn't the right time to do this, she added.
She stopped as she spotted Barrett standing with his back to them, lost in his thoughts. Eris ran over and stood beside him.
Hey, Barrett, cheer up!
Barrett didn't reply for a moment or two, and didn't look at Eris.
I ain't in no cheery mood,
he said finally, his voice extremely quiet.
So just leave me alone. Really? That's too bad,
said Eris. She spun round on her heel and ran away from Barrett. She instead ran over to Cloud and linked his arm, putting her head fondly on his shoulder.
Let's go,
she exclaimed. Ignoring Cloud's befuddled face, Tifa ran to Eris with a rather shocked expression on her face.
Wasn't that a little harsh, Eris?
She whispered. She had never seen Eris act so harsh before. Eris lifted her head from Cloud's shoulder and looked at Tifa, not at all bothered by Tifa's almost angry glare.
Just act normal when this happens,
she advised her, giving the young woman a wink. Tifa stared, not entirely sure whether Eris's thoughts were the same as hers.
You think so?
She asked.
Of course,
Eris replied confidently. She let go of Cloud, who still looked extremely confused, and ran back over to Barrett. She stopped next to him again, a sly and knowing smile already on her face, and slowly reached up on her toes to get as close to his face as she could.
We're gonna go play,
she said to him. That seemed to work. Barrett's face creased up as a large frown appeared, and he clenched his fist tightly. He started to shake slightly, until finally.
So play,
he exploded, the sound of his angry voice making everyone, including Eris, jump slightly.
Messin' round. Don't forget we're after Sephiroth.
With that he turned and ran towards one of the transportation tubes, the one marked for the Wonder Square. Everyone watched as he jumped down through the hole and disappeared, a loud whooshing sound being the only signs that he was off towards the Wonder Square. When he was gone, Eris slowly turned back to the others, a little surprised.
I think he's mad,
she said, stating the obvious.
He'll be fine,
Tifa assured her.
He seems to be doing a little better now. We had better be careful. Sephiroth might be around.
Eris sighed heavily.
I wish we could just forget everything and have fun.
She shook her head briefly and ran to another of the tubes. This one signaled to head for the Chocobo races. She turned and gave the group a small wave before jumping down through the hole and disappearing with a whoosh. Red 13 and Yuffie soon followed suit, choosing their own destinations separate from everyone else. This left Tifa and Cloud the only ones left in the station.
Shall we?
Asked Tifa. Cloud looked at her for a moment, and then slowly nodded his head. Even though Eris wanted to have fun in the park, Cloud was a little distracted. He highly doubted that Sephiroth would be in the gold saucer, and every second they wasted there would mean losing more ground between them and Sephiroth. The Shinra were also following him as well. Still, he didn't think it would hurt for them to take maybe an hour's break. It would probably cheer them all up a little. The first place that Tifa and Cloud headed to was the Wonder Square. The journey through the tubes had been exhilarating, it felt rather like traveling on a wind slide. They were almost sucked easily down the tube before turning upwards as they shot up the stalk of the gold saucer structure. When they emerged, it was with the sound of a loud whoosh as they flew straight up out of the tubes, the wind blowing them upwards, until they landed safely and securely on the ground. They took a moment to recover themselves from the journey, and then looked around at the Wonder Square. The tubes had actually taken them to long stem of the leaf structure, and the Wonder Square lay just ahead. Tifa's eyes widened as she saw it. There were stairs and a lift leading into a long tube that led the way into the Wonder Square itself, but she could already see the flashing lights and hear the ringing sounds that made a successful arcade. On the side of the glass-paneled corridor leading into the arcade center there was a large notice board flashing up adverts of all the games available, and there were a lot to choose from. She was so glad that Eris insisted on them coming here, and her spirits were lifting already. She turned to Cloud with a hopeful look in her eyes. He looked back at her and shrugged. Tifa jumped for joy and ran over to the notice board and description of the games. While she was busy choosing a game to play when they entered the arcade, Cloud stayed where he was by the tube. Unfortunately, the sight of the arcade ahead of them did not so easily lift his spirits, and he wasn't very much impressed by the gold saucer. His mind stayed entirely focused on the job that they were currently disregarding. Sephiroth could have been on the planes while they were in the air cab, heading towards his next destination. Then, he realized as he crossed his arms and thought, they would surely have spotted him crossing the plains as they flew past. Maybe he was in the gold saucer.
Hey you!
Came a peculiar, slightly mechanical voice.
What are you looking so down for?
Cloud looked up in surprise and searched round for the source of the voice. He eventually spotted someone, or rather, something heading towards him. It looked like a little black cat with a white muzzle, riding on the head of a gigantic stuffed Mog. Cloud stared as it headed towards him. The cat had a little yellow crown sitting on its head and a red cape tied around its neck. In its white-gloved hands was a yellow megaphone. It was clearly a worker in the gold saucer. The Mog was mechanical, as was the cat, Cloud presumed, controlled by two small joysticks barely noticeable on the Mog's head, its inner controls hidden by its furry covering and sealed by a large zip at the back. The cat seemed to grin at Cloud as it plodded over to him, guiding the Mog over with the joysticks. Although slightly awkward at walking, he managed it quite well, until the Mog and the cat stopped in front of Cloud.
How about it?
The cat asked him cheerfully.
Want me to read your fortune? A bright future. A happy future. Oh, but don't hold it against me if it's not a good prediction.
The cat stopped and seemed to flush a little, making Cloud wonder whether it was mechanical or not.
Oh, so sorry. I'm a fortune-telling machine. The name's Cat-She.
Cloud stared at the cat that called itself Cat. He had heard of such fortune-telling machines, but they were only a cheap gimmick. Creating them with the ability to move and talk of their own free will was just a stunt to impress customers and keep them in use. It was also clear that whoever had made this particular machine had given it personality as well. Apart from it being a machine on the inside, on the outside it was practically a living being.
You can only read the future?
Asked Cloud, deciding to ignore his inner debate on the existence of the creature. Cat almost seemed to jump back, the Mog's arms waving around in the air as though in shock.
You kidding?
He, as Cloud decided it was a he, exclaimed.
I can find missing things, missing people, anything.
Cloud turned to Tifa, who had walked up beside him after noticing the cat and his Mog counterpart head over to Cloud. She nodded slowly at him as he looked at her, answering his silent question. Cloud nodded back and then turned to Cat.
Then can you tell me where a man named Sephiroth is?
Cat's black eyes seemed to light up.
Sephiroth, right? Okay, here goes.
Cloud watched as Cat pressed a few practically invisible buttons on the Mog's head, and then vigorously moved the two joysticks back and forth. In response, the Mog made a peculiar mechanical grinding sound and began to rock back and forth in opposition to Cat's movements. After a few moments of this, Cat stopped, and a small ticket slid up out of the Mog's head. Cat tore it off and held it out to Cloud with a beaming smile. Cloud took it and looked down at it.
Ordinary luck,
he read blankly, with Tifa looking over his shoulder.
It will be an act of fortune. Give in to the goodwill of others, and something big will happen after summer. Wait. What's this? Hey.
Cat said. He leaned over the Mog and snatched the paper back from Cloud. He was surprisingly flexible for a machine. His eyes scanned the paper for a second, before he carelessly threw it aside.
Let me try it again.
He went through the entire process again. Cloud and Tifa watched as the Mog rocked back and forth, its feet moving with them. Only Cat's balance on top was what kept the Mog from falling over. Another slip of paper then emerged from the head of the Mog, and Cat tore it off and gave it to Cloud, who read it again.
Be careful of forgetfulness. Your lucky color is blue.
Cloud shook his head and threw the paper aside, growing irritated.
Forget it.
Cat looked up desperately, clutching his megaphone in his hand.
Wait, give me another chance.
He pleaded, sounding as desperate as he looked. He almost jumped up and down on the Mog's head, trying to keep their attention.
Wait. Let me try it again.
Cloud and Tifa sighed heavily and waited while the rather irritating Cat She went through its entire fortune-telling process for a third time. This time Cat pushed it harder and the Mog rocked vigorously back and forth, almost slipping over itself in Cat's desperation. Cloud almost got the impression that the machine wanted to talk to them. Perhaps it felt lonely just talking to people day after day, or... He never got the chance to finish his thoughtful debate, for Cat had finished and was already tearing off the new slip of paper with its last prediction. For a moment Cloud considered just walking away without reading it, for it was sure to be a useless prediction. Still, the cat seemed to want to talk, so he sighed and took the paper. He read it silently this time, and then his blue eyes opened wide.
What they?
He cried.
What does it say?
Asked Tifa, pushing herself on her toes so she could see over Cloud's shoulder. Cloud held the paper up and read it out loud.
What you pursue will be yours. But you will lose something dear.
He lowered the paper and looked at Tifa, the expression in his eyes showing exactly what he was thinking. It sounded like a rather chilling prediction, and was certainly not anything like Cat's previous 2 attempts. Even Cat looked a little chilled by it, for his face was set and the Mog's body was shivering slightly as though terrified by what it had come up with.
I don't know if it's good or bad,
Cat said finally. He put his megaphone down and scratched the back of his head thoughtfully.
This is the first time I ever got something like this.
He picked up his megaphone again, and looked at Cloud and Tifa.
Then shall we? Excuse me?
Asked Tifa, wondering what the cat was leading up to. Cat sighed and leaned forward on the Mog.
As a fortune teller,
he began, speaking as though it was an obvious assumption.
I can't help but think about this. If I don't see what it leads to, I won't be able to relax.
He suddenly jumped upright on the Mog, megaphone raised high.
That's why I'm going with you.
Tifa slowly turned to Cloud.
Is it all right, Cloud?
She asked him.
I'm coming with you no matter what you say,
Cat said with sudden determinism. As if to prove his point, he bounded over behind Cloud and moved the Mog's arms so they gave him a harsh push towards the arcade, making him stagger and he almost fell over.
Hey!
Cloud snapped. He looked back at Cat, and then, realizing that they weren't going to get rid of the cat anytime soon, he shrugged. While a very happy Cat dragged off Tifa and Cloud towards the arcade of the Wonder Square, the others were all busy with their own exploration of the gold saucer and its other attractions. Yuffie had set up her place in the chocobo races, standing close to the banisters that overlooked the racetrack whilst keeping an eye out for any possible security guards that were watching her. More so, she was looking out for unsuspecting customers, in particular the travelers who were unwary and often had their belongings on show. She didn't stay in any one place for long and moved quickly throughout the chocobo square, grinning each time she pinched a new item. Red 13 found himself in the event square on the top floor of the theme park. Safely encased within the leaf's thick structure, he could see and hear everything going on. Crowds of people were lined up on benches in front of a huge stage, waiting for the next show to start. The air was heavy with the scent of popcorn, toffee apples, and other such sweets. It made him feel a little sick, but seeing the people so happy made him forget about the others, at least for a little while. As Barrett emerged from the tunnel halfway up the gold saucer stem, he found himself at the entrance of the battle square. Neither the Wonder Square nor the Speed Square had impressed him at all. In fact, he had found all the noise and the people a mere annoyance. There was no place quiet in the gold saucer, which was what he wanted. Yet, as he looked up at the steps leading up to the battle square, felt the faint twinge of a smile at the corner of his mouth. The battle square was, as its name said, a place for battles. It was probably the best place to let off a little steam. So he headed briskly up the steps, making sure his gun arm was cocked and ready to fire, and went through the open entrance. Eris, finally, had made her way straight towards the round square, on one of the lower levels of the theme park. The round square was built on one of the open leaves of the park, so she could see the sky up ahead of her, as well as the rest of the park. She was sure that at night, when the stars were at their fullest in the sky with all the lights of the gold saucer shining around, it would be a most spectacular sight. End of chapter. Episode 42, Part 04, Chapter 42. Chapter 42. A full hour passed by before Cloud, Tifa, and Kat emerged at the entrance to the battle square. They had spent a riveting half an hour in the Wonder Square and its amazing attractions, from the virtual fighting system to a cute little game about a Mog learning to fly, which had amused Tifa to no end. They had found the others except Barrett as they wandered around, but no one else came with them. They were too busy exploring on their own. Cloud was the first to emerge from the hollowed-out tunnels guarding the tubes and headed towards the stairs. The first thing he noticed as he looked around was that it was surprisingly quiet in this area of the park. He could still hear the faint sounds of music from the Wonder Square and screams from the Speed Square, but there were no sounds coming from the Battle Square. When Tifa and Kat came out of the tunnel, Kat annoyed at the wind tunnels ruffling his fur, Cloud's gaze fell on a Shinra guard who was standing at the bottom of the stairs. His gaze was caught by the way the guard was standing unnaturally still and rigid, as though someone was behind him and holding him upright, almost like a puppet. Looking closer, Cloud could see a blank expression behind the shadowed-out visor, as well as the faint trickle of a red liquid at the corner of the soldier's mouth. Cloud exclaimed suddenly. The sound of his cry seemed to shake the soldier free, for he suddenly fell to his knees and collapsed face forward onto the floor, his helmet falling off his head and rolling across the floor. He ran forward and knelt beside the soldier, reaching just under the rim of his helmet to feel for a pulse on the side of his neck. There was no throb, no gentle rhythm that signified blood pulsating through veins, not a single pulse. Cloud could see that the soldier's eyes were still open in an expression of total surprise.
Dead.
Cloud whispered under his breath, fighting off the cold shiver that was threatening to run down his spine.
What?
Tifa said. She ran beside Cloud and knelt down beside the soldier. Seeing the soldier's frozen face, she reached out and gently shut the soldier's eyes, letting him sleep. Then she looked up as she saw Cloud climb to his feet and begin to run up the stairs towards the battle square, with one hand firmly around the handle of his sword.
Wait, Cloud.
She and Kat followed Cloud up the stairs and ran inside the square. They found Cloud inside, standing in the middle of the waiting area just outside the arena. She and Kat stopped next to him, and looked around at what he was looking at. The waiting area was filled with people, all of them lying on the ground in small pools of blood. They were sure that they were all dead, but judging from the size of the blood pools, they hadn't been dead for too long. The two receptionists were slumped over their desks, their hair strewn over their faces, their hands still grasping onto the edges of the desks in desperation. Cloud found his fists shaking almost uncontrollably, and he fought to contain them.
Did Sephiroth do this?
He said, barely able to suppress his anger. Before Tifa could put her hand on his shoulder, Cloud dashed forward to one of the guards lying dead in the middle of the floor. Again Cloud checked for a pulse, but he knew just from looking that the guard was dead. It made him think back to the Shinra building, when all the Shinra employees lay dead on the floor. Thinking of that made Cloud notice something he hadn't before. There were no deep cutting sword wounds on this guard, or the one lying dead outside. There was a wound penetrating his armor, but it was too rounded, too rough to have come from a sword, even one as long and as swift as Sephiroth's. It looked more like a gunshot wound.
No. It's not him.
Cloud confirmed, not noticing that Tifa and Kat had stepped up behind him to look at the guard.
They're all shot. Sephiroth would never use a gun.
He stood up as Tifa knelt down to close the dead soldier's frozen eyes, lowering her head in silent prayer for another innocent life lost, although she was secretly glad that this time it wasn't Sephiroth's doing. A moment or two after she started praying, a strange noise began to sound throughout the waiting area. It sounded like a gurgle, choked with blood. Tifa jumped to her feet and spun around just in time to see one of the female receptionists shudder awake and cough. There was at least one person alive. She and Cloud ran over to her.
Hey, what happened?
Cloud asked quickly. The receptionist slowly turned her head and tried to look up at Cloud and Tifa. She found she could not move very much, for each breath hurt. It was no wonder Cloud and Tifa noted as they looked down at her, for she had 2 very bad bullet wounds in her chest, and blood had stained half her uniform. They very much doubted that she would live for very long.
Ugh. Ugh.
The woman mumbled, hardly able to control her own voice. She coughed, and Tifa gently rubbed her back. A few specks of blood fell onto the desk before the woman was ready to speak.
A man with a gun.
She whispered, her voice coarse.
On his arm.
Tifa jumped back, her face rapidly turning pale.
A gun on his arm.
She cried. She turned to look at Cloud, her eyes large and fearful in denial of what she was hearing. Cloud looked back at her, his face firm. There was no doubt that they were both thinking the same thing. They knew only one man who had a gun on his arm. And that was Barrett.
Hold it right there. And stay quiet.
Cloud and Tifa spun round to face the entrance, in time to see 2 guards burst into the waiting area, guns in hand, looking around at the dead lying in the room. As they saw Kat, Cloud, and Tifa they cocked their guns and aimed at them, ready to fire at the slightest movement. The 3 did as they were told and stood frozen, not even twitching. The only one who moved was the receptionist, as her head fell back down onto the desk and she shut her eyes, unconsciousness overcoming her once more. As they stood there, the doors opened once again and another man walked into the battle square. A very tall, muscular man, dressed in only a tight pair of shorts and a head of long, brushed-back black hair. Cloud recognized him, from a brief glimpse of a statue he had seen upon their arrival at the Gold Saucer. He was Dio, the owner of the Gold Saucer theme park. He certainly didn't look happy as he saw them standing there, amongst the dead. He looked around at his dead workers and the few dead customers, before settling his stern gaze on Cloud and his 2 friends.
Did you guys do this?
He demanded. His voice seemed to resonate with such strength that it made Tifa and Cloud jump, although Kat remained perfectly motionless. Clearly whatever his program was, it wasn't so easily startled. Cloud was the first to speak.
No,
he protested.
It wasn't us.
Dio stared back at them, and it was clear from the look on his face that he didn't believe Cloud's protest of innocence. It was also clear from the way the guards raised their guns, as though ready to fire. It was then that Kat finally jumped in realization, and he turned to Cloud.
Hurry and run, it's gonna get ugly.
He said. Without even a moment's hesitation the mechanical cat turned away and bounded rapidly across the floor, disappearing through the back door that led into the arena before the guards had a chance to focus their guns on him.
Hey!
Cloud called. He shook his head vigorously before he spun round and grabbed Tifa's hand. He pulled her harshly towards the door where Kat had disappeared, taking their chance to escape while the guards were confused. Dio stared angrily and snapped round to face the guards.
Hold them!
He commanded. The 2 soldiers saluted back at him before they ran down the steps and through the door leading into the battle square arena. Cloud and Tifa followed rapidly as Kat continued to bound through the dark tunnel to the arena, pushing his counterpart Mog Body as fast as it could go. Soon the dark tunnel was flooded with light as they entered the battle arena, and skidded to a complete stop. They found themselves standing on a square-shaped platform in the middle of a fairly large arena. It looked surprisingly plain, with only 2 doors leading out, one being the one they came through, and the other at the far end, although they didn't know where that one would lead to. From what they could see though, that door was bolted shut. And with nowhere else to go, they were cornered.
That's as far as you go,
came the bold voice of Dio from the tunnel. The three turned back as Dio entered the arena, along with the two guards. Dio looked at them for a moment before lifting one of his large hands with its thick, muscle-filled fingers, and clicked them loudly. Cat immediately jumped and turned away towards the back door and their only exit.
Wait, listen to...
Cloud began, but Cat soon interrupted him.
Cloud?
The cat stammered nervously. Cloud turned around in time to see the back door unlock itself and open up to reveal another dark tunnel leading deeper into the arena. But from that tunnel came the shadow of a large robot heading towards them. It stepped out of the dark tunnel and into the light, revealing a strong metal-plated body and a set of strong, thick, robotic arms, perfectly designed for grabbing prisoners and refusing to let them go. It stamped into the arena on heavy feet and blocked the exit as Cat jumped back towards Cloud and Tifa. Dio clicked his fingers again. The three looked up towards the viewing balcony surrounding the arena as two more doors opened and a robot stepped out of each one. The robots looked around blindly for a moment, before settling their mechanical eyes on the group in the middle of the arena. Their eyes flashed red as they locked on, before jumping down off the balcony and landing at the corners of the arena beside Dio. Cloud, Cat, and Tifa slowly began to back off to the center of the arena, so close that their bodies pressed against one another with nowhere else to go. Tifa grasped onto Cloud's hand as the three robots then began to walk towards them, their robot arms raised up as they walked, and ready to grab them before they could attempt an escape.
One more to go,
said Dio, a superior smile on his face as he watched. Ahead of him, Cloud was the only one left in the secret room in the center of the gold saucer stem. Still caught in the guard robot's huge robotic arms, Cloud was struggling fiercely to break free as he hovered above a temporarily closed trapdoor hatch. Tifa and Cat had already gone through the trapdoor, carried down by their robot captors. Behind him Cloud heard Dio click his fingers again, signaling the robot to go ahead.
Yes,
came the guard's reply, and through the corner of his eye Cloud saw him run over to the hatch controls, his hands about to pull the lever that would open the door and drop him through.
Hey!
Cloud exclaimed in one more desperate attempt to get Dio to listen to him.
Pay attention!
Dio looked at him, uncaring.
There's no need to listen,
he replied simply.
Pay for your crime down below.
He waved his arm to the guard.
Do it. Yes.
Cloud shook his head fiercely, unable to believe that he had somehow got caught up in this mess. Dio seemed unprepared to listen, catching them in the battle square at that moment was enough to convince him that they were involved, and the receptionist was in no condition to say otherwise. Behind him the guard pulled on the lever and the hatch opened with a loud whoosh. A gust of sandy, dusty air flew up and filled the chamber, filling Cloud's throat and making it dry and painful. He had no time to cough however, for the robot then made a stomach-wrenching jump and jumped down through the trapdoor, carrying Cloud down with it. Desert prison. Cloud woke as a hot stab of pain shot through his eye and his throat. Instinctively he pushed himself up away from the sand and took a breath, but that just made him swallow even more sand and burned his throat even more. He rubbed his eye with one hand and held his throat with the other, a strange mixture of coughing and crying from his right eye. Only when he finished coughing up the sand did he notice the hand that was on his shoulder, and the other hand rubbing his back.
Cloud, you all right?
Came Tifa's concerned voice. Cloud nodded briefly, still temporarily unable to talk while the burning of the hot sand in his throat calmed down. As he looked up he saw Tifa kneeling next to him, looking as concerned as she sounded. He also noted that Cat was standing nearby as well, showing that Dio didn't even care that Cat was a mechanical being. Now recovered, Cloud stood up and looked around. The first thing he noticed was the sand. They were surrounded on all sides by vast amounts of sand, so hot that he could feel the heat even through his thickly soled boots. The sand seemed to stretch ahead of them for miles, but he could see the outline of mountains in the distance. There were other things around him, Cloud noticed as he slowly turned around to look behind him. They were standing next to a large set of buildings, one of which had a large tube hanging down from where they had been so carelessly dropped to the bottom. The land around them was also heavily laden with a lot of rubbish. Broken bits of metal, empty boxes, and crates, anything that was of little use had been dumped in the sandy lands. Although evidence showed that some of it had been serviced for other uses, they were crude creations. Finally, a large barbed wire fence bordered the land around them, although in some area the fence had been torn away, leaving gaping holes.
Where are we?
Cloud asked.
A desert prison.
Cat replied.
Corel prison.
Cloud turned to look at him.
A desert prison?
He asked. Cat nodded his head and motioned to the plains of sand that surrounded them on all sides, surrounding the buildings, the rubbish, and beyond the fence.
Yup, a natural prison in the middle of the desert.
He explained.
Surrounded entirely by quicksand. I heard that once you get in, you never get out. But, there was one special exception.
Cloud was about to ask what this special exception was, when Tifa suddenly stood up and exclaimed loudly and pointed straight ahead of them, deeper into the so-called prison that Cat was telling them about. Cloud stood up and looked as well, and his eyes opened wide in surprise at what she had seen.
Barret!
Tifa exclaimed. Cat turned around and looked to where the two were pointing. Sure enough, standing just a few meters away from them and partially hidden by a pile of crates filled with trash, was Barret. He was standing with his back to them at that point, his head lowered as he looked at something on the ground. From where he was, Cat could just about see the edge of his gun arm, pointing at the floor. The cat stared, until Cloud walked past him and headed over to the dark man standing so silently away from them. As Cloud approached, he saw what Barret was looking at. Lying at his feet was a dead man, not a gold saucer worker, but a simple man dressed in rather rugged clothing, thick with dirt and sand. A single bullet wound was visible in his chest, and although blood stained his shirt, there was no pool yet, so he had not been dead for very long. Cloud looked up at Barret's blank, emotionless expression.
Barret?
He said, his voice low.
Did he really?
Barret finally seemed to notice Cloud standing behind him and turned around. His blank expression changed a little as he saw Cloud, but Cloud couldn't make out what the expression was meant to be. Sadness, anger, and even hatred maybe, they all seemed to be fused together into one expression. Cloud took a step forward towards him, but Barret instantly stepped back, careful to avoid the dead man lying face down behind him.
Stay back!
Barret warned Cloud sternly before he could say anything. Cloud noticed that Barret continued to keep his one good hand on his gun arm, as though on a constant alert for something.
This is something I gotta deal with. Just leave me alone.
He then turned sharply and ran off, kicking up a cloud of sand behind him as he tore off away from Cloud. He ran through the open fence ahead of him, a separate fence leading to another area of the desert prison. Cloud could do nothing but watch him, before he looked back down at the dead man. A bullet wound? Could it really have been Barret?
Huyo!
Came Cat's voice. Cloud looked through the corner of his eye as the cat bounded up beside him, daring to come out now that Barret was out of sight.
That's one of your friends? He sure looks dangerous.
Cloud sighed and looked over to Tifa, who was also standing beside him.
Barret!
She whispered softly, before looking at Cloud. He knew what she was thinking. After all, he had been thinking the same thing. Ever since they had reached North Corel, Barret had been acting very strangely. It would have been no surprise if it was a Shinra soldier lying dead in front of them, but this was an ordinary man, an innocent who had nothing to do with the Shinra. In fact, he was probably a prisoner himself, although not anymore. They had thought maybe things were getting back to normal when they arrived at Gold Saucer, but it was clear now that things were nowhere near back to normal. After they had moved the dead man out of the way, giving him a slightly better place to rest until someone could bury him, the three made their way into the main part of the desert prison. Corel Prison, as Cat called it, looked very much like a small open town, built in the middle of the desert at the very base of the Gold Saucer. In fact, they could see the Gold Saucer stem in the very center, surrounded by small houses. That was obviously the main complex for the entire prison, and most likely the only way back up to civilization. There was no doubt that this town had been left in disarray for a number of years, reconstructed from whatever its citizens could find. Of course, its citizens were not ordinary people who lived there by will. They were all prisoners sent down from the Gold Saucer to spend the rest of their days in the sandy prison. They were a rough-looking bunch too, punks with multicolored hair and many piercings, and eager eyes looking to snatch anything they could. In fact, as Cloud and the others looked around at the prison, they began to notice just how much like a small town it really looked. The houses that were still standing were rather neatly arranged, as though they had once been part of a neatly constructed town. Originally built of wood, they noticed that they carried the remnants of burn marks, with metal reconstructing some of the houses. Corel Prison. It couldn't possibly have been the town of Corel. A flash of movement caught their attention, and the three turned their attention to one of the abandoned houses standing nearby. They were sure they saw the door gently swing shut, and something, or someone, moving inside. They couldn't be sure whether it was Barret, but there were no other signs of him in the prison, so they headed towards the empty house. The door creaked loudly as Cloud pushed it open, much louder than they thought it would, and they froze until the echoes faded and silence returned to the house. The inside of the house was in just as bad condition as it was on the outside. In fact, it looked like a bomb had hit it, but more likely it had been raided by thieves. Shelves were broken, tables were shattered, and the couch stood on only two left legs while the rest of it tilted to the side with a number of slash and bullet holes in it. Books and shards of glass covered the floor, cracking under their feet as they walked in. The house was also heavy with dust, dirt, and sand, making Tifa's nose itch as she fought back a sneeze. There was no sign of Barrett in the house, but they weren't all too surprised. There was another door at the other end of the house, so anyone who came in could easily have gone out that way and avoided them. Yet, for a second they thought they could hear shuffling, until the sound of footsteps began to echo around them. They turned towards the second door just moments before it opened, and jumped as they saw Barrett's large frame standing in its frame, his body slightly outlined by the sunlight shining in from outside. It was clear that Barrett wasn't happy to see them there. A large frown covered his face, his eyebrows drawn close together as he stared at them furiously. Yet there was something odd about his gaze, something Cloud couldn't quite place.
"Didn't I tell you not to come here?"
Barrett shouted. His voice echoed all the way through the empty house, the echo dull as it hit the dust and sand in the air. Before anyone could have a chance to explain, Barrett suddenly raised his gun arm and pointed it at them. Cat jumped back fiercely, waving his little arms madly.
"Ju! Just hold on for a second."
The cat squealed frantically, almost dropping his megaphone in sheer panic.
"We just want to talk. You'll understand if you just hear us out."
He had barely finished his sentence when Barrett suddenly opened fire, and everyone in the room flinched and shielded themselves with their arms. For a full 5 seconds Barrett let loose a parade of bullets into the air, the chug noise of his gun making painful sounds. After those 5 seconds Barrett stopped and lowered his gun, his face set and level. Only when he finished did Cloud and the others lower their arms and look around bewildered, before they finally realized that Barrett was not aiming at them at all. Behind them the couch, with its new pattern of fresh bullet wounds, gave out an almighty wheeze and a pop as stale air burst out, followed by a cloud of stuffing from the inside. Cloud and Tifa turned, and a second later they saw a figure stand up from behind the couch, a number of bullet wounds in his body, before he fell onto the ground in a dead heap. It was one of the prisoners, hiding in the house. Once dead, Barrett turned away from them and refused to meet their gazes.
"Didn't want none of ya to get involved,"
he said simply.
"Hey, that's Cloud's line."
Barrett looked up sharply and raised his gun, almost firing again as the door behind him suddenly opened up and 3 figures ran into the house. He relaxed as he saw that it was only the others, Eris, Yuffie, and Red 13. He slowly lowered his gun, looking a little ashamed at aiming at them.
"It's too dangerous, I can't let you get involved. Blah, blah, blah."
Eris imitated sarcastically, ignoring the gun that had been pointing her way. She winked at Cloud, who tried to look like he hadn't heard the rather accurate imitation of him.
"Yeah. We're already involved in this,"
said Tifa.
"We saw you and hurried here,"
said Eris, answering Cloud's silent question as he looked at her and then the others.
"Barrett, just tell us what's going on."
Barrett slowly looked from one group to the other, before he finally looked down at the ground.
"You guys?"
he muttered, his voice barely audible. It was clear to him that there was no way out for him now. He had no choice but to tell them the whole truth about everything that was going on.
"I heard that the murders at the battle arena were done by a man with a gun arm,"
said Red 13. He walked past Barrett and climbed up onto the old, rotting couch, settling back on his haunches in preparation for a long story. He looked at Barrett through his fiery eyes.
"Was that you?"
Barrett shook his head fiercely, before he sighed heavily.
"There's another,"
he began.
"Another man that got a gun grafted into one of his arms. It was 4 years ago. I remember. I was on my way home after visiting a Mako reactor being built."
End of chapter. Episode 43, Part 04, Chapter 43. Chapter 43. 3 days had passed before Dine and Barrett finally reached Mount Corel again, glad to see the rocky landscape and the mines, although the mines were now abandoned now that the Mako reactor had been built. They were relieved to be back on their own continent after the long journey across the sea, where they had seen a Mako reactor being built in another town. Like Dine, Many people had been reluctant to allow Shinra to build a reactor, afraid it would ruin the landscape. They had eventually given in, but only because they had no choice. The reactors had proved to be very prosperous, and money had been flowing in steadily into the towns where reactors were built. There were rumors going around that the land around the reactors was slowly withering and dying, but so far Shinra were denying all knowledge of that. Dine and Barrett were just crossing the bridge away from the Mount Corel reactor when it happened. They had tried to ignore the unsightly form of the reactor embedded in the mountain crevice that had once been the main mining point for Corel, the tunnels now filled with pipes sucking in Mako instead of coal. They were eagerly waiting to see the sights of home, when they looked ahead and saw an old man they recognized from Corel running towards them. Red-faced and panting hard, it looked like he had been running for a long while.
Barrett! Dine!
The old man called as he ran across the bridge, staggering a little as he ran. Unable to run any further, he stopped a few feet away from them, his lungs heaving for air, although he managed to gain enough breath to shout out his message.
Come quick! The village is being attacked. It's Shinra soldiers.
Barrett jumped back.
What?
He cried. Without waiting to hear any more, he turned and jumped off the bridge to its rocky base, dashing to the end to look out at North Corel and the desert beyond. Dine was right behind him, the same thoughts crossing his mind. They stopped at the end of the ledge and looked out. Their eyes opened wide as their gazes fell on the sights of North Corel at the mountain's exit, and the red-hot flames that were rising up from it. Although they could not hear the screams, they could imagine what must be going on in Corel at that moment, people running and screaming, desperate to get away from the flames and the smoke as it choked the last of the life out of them. Barrett stared angrily, feeling the fire burning in his own eyes even at this distance. Suddenly he threw his arms up to the air and shook them madly, barely able to contain his horror.
What the hell happened?
He raged. His throat was dry, as though the smoke had somehow reached him and was eating away at his throat and lungs. Was all he could say. He fell down onto his knees, his palms pressed firmly against the rock, and shook, wishing he could break the rock into pieces as he watched North Corel burn. Behind him Dine also saw the flames, but instead of seething in anger like Barrett, he slowly looked away. This was just what he had been so afraid of, Shinra going against the deal and wiping them out, leaving them free to do whatever they liked. He was suddenly broken from his thoughts as Barrett hit the ground with his fist, and was brought back to reality. He shook his head and looked at his friend kneeling on the floor.
Hey, Barrett! It's not over yet,
he said, sounding positive. Barrett slowly turned his head and looked up at him, fighting back the tears of rage that were welling inside of him as he looked up at Dine hopefully.
Everyone's waiting. Let's go back to the village.
Barrett continued to stare at him for a few seconds more, feeling sure that Dine was holding on to a false hope. Still, even a false hope was worth holding on to at a time such as this, so he nodded his head and climbed to his feet, his arms aching from the strain of pushing down on solid rock. They turned back to the bridge, where the old man was looking back down the path with a look of fear on his face. Suddenly he turned back to them and called out desperately.
Barrett! Dine! Protect the village!
He shouted, before he turned and began to run across the bridge. Dine and Barrett soon saw why he was running, for at that moment a group of 4 Shinra soldiers suddenly emerged from the mountain path and onto the bridge. Their rifles already raised and cocked ready, they opened fire on the old man as he tried to flee.
HMP! Old man!
Barrett cried, but it was far too late. The old man fell face down onto the bridge and moved no more, his life snuffed out by the bullets. As the Shinra soldiers looked around for them, Barrett looked to Dine. Dine nodded back at him, and they turned to run under the bridge out of sight of the soldiers. Dine was the only one who made it there. As he jumped aside towards the bridge, the 4 soldiers located Barrett and opened fire. Barrett jumped back as bullets struck the ground near his feet, riddling the ground and sending dust into the air. Barrett was forced to keep his feet moving as the bullets danced around him, otherwise he'd lose his feet.
"Come on, Barrett,"
came Dine's voice from the bridge.
"We gotta hurry."
Barrett looked ahead as the bullets danced past him, and saw Dine running under the bridge to the other side, where a natural rocky ledge was standing. Barrett spotted his chance as the soldiers stopped firing for a split second to reload their guns. Barrett grunted loudly and threw himself forward just before they fired again and ran to the bridge, leaping underneath the wooden form of the bridge and jumping to Dine on the other side. As the two stopped on the ledge, they heard the sound of guns firing again, but the bullets landed nowhere near them. Barrett and Dine stood firm against the mountain wall, when they heard another sound cut through the gunfire. The soldiers stopped firing as Scarlet, still in her red silk dress, stepped up from the mountain path, laughing her annoying laugh. Dine turned to Barrett and grabbed his arm.
"Barrett! You stay here!"
he ordered his friend sternly.
"Ki-ha, ha!"
Scarlet cackled, stopping just behind the soldiers. The soldiers looked back at her smug face.
"You can shoot all day and never hit them with aim like that."
Barrett turned back to Dine and shook his arm free.
"Shoo up,"
he replied, realizing what Dine was probably planning. While they were arguing, Scarlet moved over and knocked one of the soldiers off the bridge, letting him fall over the edge and onto the ledge below, knocked out from the fall. The other soldiers raised their guns instantly and aimed at Barrett and Dine, awaiting Scarlet's orders.
"Ha, ha, ha!"
Scarlet laughed, covering her mouth daintily like an actor playing up the role of a damsel. She then stopped laughing and motioned to the soldiers.
"Stop playing around and cover me."
The soldiers didn't waste any time in doing so. They moved around her and guarded her in a half-circle, now in a better position to fire at the two as they stood cornered on the ledge. Then, when Scarlet pointed ahead, they opened fire.
"Watch out!"
called Dine. He moved forward in the hope of moving in front of Barrett and shielding him from the approaching gunfire, but as he stepped forward his foot caught on a loose piece of rock lying on the ledge. He staggered, but lost his balance and slipped off the edge of the ledge, falling towards the chasm. Barrett was by his side in an instant, grabbing hold of Dine's hand and holding it tightly to stop him from falling. Falling to his knees, Barrett kept his fist firmly around Dine's hand as his friend dangled loosely over the long chasm leading to the foot of the mountain. If Dine fell, there would be a very minimal chance that he'd survive.
"Dine!"
Barrett shouted desperately, his voice barely heard over the sound of the gunfire.
"Hang on! Listen to me! You're coming back to the village, here?"
Below him, Dine looked up meekly, a cut on his forehead from where his head had connected with the mountain wall.
"Yeah,"
he replied, sounding slightly dazed.
"I ain't letting go. You're coming back. Everyone's waiting for you. Eleanor and Marlene. They all waiting on us."
Up on the bridge, Scarlet urged the soldiers on, shouting at them hysterically for them to continue firing and aim right. Slowly but surely the line of bullets moved across the mountain wall, getting closer and closer to the spot where Barrett was holding on so desperately to Dine. The bullets moved right along the ridge, to where Barrett's hand was holding onto Dine's wrist. Barrett cried out and clenched his eyes shut suddenly as he felt the pang of a dozen bullets suddenly fire into his right arm. At the same time Dine cried out, feeling the same pang in his left arm. Barrett clenched his teeth tight and held on as hard as he could, fighting back the pain. Then, without warning, he suddenly felt his arm go limp, his muscles giving way and his arm falling loose. He looked down just in time to see his grip fall free, releasing Dine's arm. He looked further down and saw Dine's blank face looking back up at him, still reaching out with his own weak left arm as he fell back away from the ledge and down into the chasm, the shadows swallowing him up and out of Barrett's sight.
From then on, I couldn't use my right arm no more,
said Barrett slowly, closing his eyes as he remembered Dine's calm, accepting face as he fell away from the ledge. He had almost seemed to accept his face, and that image was burned into the back of Barrett's mind.
I was depressed for a while. But then I threw away my artificial arm and got this gun grafted in.
He turned away from the others, and looked down at the unnatural metal gun that had replaced his hand.
Got a new right arm to get revenge on the Shinra, who took everything away.
He put his good hand over the cold metal and gripped it tight, before he turned back to the others.
Back then, I heard the doc say there was another man who got the same operation as me. But his was the left arm.
Around him, the others remained silent for a few moments as they absorbed all this information, thinking it over. A lot of things were beginning to make sense now, such as Barrett's intense dislike for the Shinra. Now they knew why he had acted the way he did. It was all a case of getting revenge for what the Shinra had taken away from him. And being in Corel prison, rebuilt from what had once been his home, had brought it all back to him. It also answered the question as to who had committed the murders up in the battle square. The one other man who had a gun arm. Dine. Cloud breathed softly.
But,
Eris said suddenly, the first to break the silence that had filled the hut.
Dine's injury was the same as yours, right? Yeah, that's right,
said Tifa, clicking her fingers.
He was deceived by the Shinra, too. He'll probably join us to fight against the Shinra.
Barrett shook his head firmly.
Wouldn't bet on it,
he replied.
I gotta polo guys to Dine before I can rest in peace.
He lifted his gun arm and cocked it ready.
And that's why, I gotta go alone.
Everyone stayed silent, looking at Barrett.
Do whatever you want,
Cloud said suddenly, surprising everyone. One by one they turned to look at Cloud, who had turned away at the end of the story, his eyes shut. Then he slowly opened his eyes and looked at Barrett.
Is that what you want to hear?
He asked. He shook his head fiercely.
Well, I can't let you do it. Because, if you die on me, I'm gonna have nightmares. Barrett, this isn't the end,
said Eris, catching on to what Cloud was saying.
Weren't you going to save the planet?
Asked Tifa. Barrett glared at her angrily, his temper flaring again.
Shit.
He cursed.
Tifa, you ought to know by now.
Tifa jumped slightly and flushed a little as she recalled the true reason. Saving the planet had never been part of Barrett's plans. To everyone else, Avalanche was a resistance group trying to save the planet. For Barrett, it was just a way to get his revenge on the Shinra. Tifa put her hands together and looked down at them.
That's all right,
she said quietly, a faint smile on her face.
I'm not so different from you. That's easier to understand,
said Eris.
It's you, Barrett. So there it is, Barrett,
Cloud said, walking up to him.
So I guess it'll be Barrett, me, and...
He looked around at the others, waiting for someone to volunteer to join them. After all, it wasn't necessary for them all to go in search of Dine, and it was dangerous inside the prison.
Shall I go with you?
Said Red 13. Cloud slowly nodded his head in agreement. He was hoping Red 13 would volunteer. Troublesome prisoners would be less likely to bother them with Red 13 around. From a distance he just looked like a big, fierce wolf. He was sure the others would be able to look after themselves.
You sure are all acting pretty heroic,
Yuffie commented suddenly. She jumped over to the couch and sat back in its old seats, sinking back into the cushions as she prepared for the wait.
Considerin' we're not making any money on this.
Cloud and his group never heard Yuffie's last words, for they had already left the house and shut the door behind them, making sure the door was secure and the others were safe inside. As Cloud had hoped, the majority of the prisoners stayed away from them once they saw Red 13. The ones who did dare approach Cloud and Barrett were quickly scared off once Red 13 extended his long claws and bared his teeth, giving them such a snarl that they quickly turned and fled with their money-pinching fingers fleeing ahead of them. It wasn't too long before Cloud, Barrett, and Red 13 were back where they all started, just outside the perimeter of the prison. As they discovered as they walked along close to the fence was that the prison was rather open, and they were perfectly free to step out into the desert if they wanted to. However, they all knew about the invisible pits of quicksand that dotted the desert, and so they kept as close as they could to the fence. They found that part of the fence was broken about 30 meters out of the prison, leading into another part of the prison that was filled with disused junk that had been so carelessly dropped from the gold saucer and moved aside by the residents of the prison. Red 13 was the one who found the injured man first, catching the scent of blood on the wind. He ran ahead and found the man, another prisoner, lying face down on the sand. He was still alive, but it wouldn't be long before he died also, and there was nothing they could do for him. Cloud knelt down and saw a deep, bloody wound in the man's back.
"This one's been shot, too,"
he observed. He looked up suddenly as he heard the steady, constant sound of gunfire ring out through the air. Red 13 pricked up his ears and listened, his nose twitching as he tried to catch the scent on the breeze. Unable to smell anything, he suddenly leaped up onto a strange metal machine covered in rust just lying on the sand, and took another deep breath of air. This time he did catch a scent, a human scent, along with metal.
"Over there,"
he called back down to Cloud and Barrett, motioning around the next corner of crates and machinery. Barrett wasted no time in running forward, startling Cloud as he brushed rudely past him and down the sandy path. He ignored Cloud's calls for him to slow down and ran on. He was sure that it was Dine behind the next corner, he could almost sense him. He finally reached the corner and turned it, skidding to a stop as he turned. His jaw fell open as he saw the figure standing ahead of him at the edge of a ridge that had opened up in the middle of the desert. There standing ahead of him, dressed in old rags that were in desperate need of a good wash. His skin was scarred and pale, and he was incredibly thin, as though he hadn't eaten properly for days. His clothes hung off his frail body, and in one of his legs there was a terrible scar showing through the tears of his trousers. And there, on his left arm, was a gun grafted onto his flesh. He didn't look up at Barrett as he approached, nor as Cloud and Red 13 finally caught up to him and stopped behind him. He simply stood, his head lowered to look at the ground, firing steadily into an old stone wall and a fence beside him. Barrett stared, open-mouthed, as he saw Dine standing ahead of him. It was definitely Dine, there was no doubt in his mind. Through the corner of his eye he saw Cloud walking up behind him, and very quickly put his hand out to warn Cloud back. Cloud stopped but did not move back, and Barrett slowly began to walk forward towards Dine, who continued to fire into the fence.
"Dine,"
Barrett said, his voice stammering.
"Is that you?"
Dine stopped firing and let his arm fall loosely by his side. He lifted his head very slowly and let his eyes fall on Barrett. He seemed to stare blankly for a few seconds, as though he couldn't see or couldn't quite focus on him. Then a faint look of recognition crossed his face. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly into an expression that could only have been described as pure anger, before falling back into an expressionless glare.
"Now that's a voice I haven't heard in years,"
he said, his voice low. He then began to walk forward, walking with a strong limp on the leg where the large scar was showing. Clearly when he had fallen off the cliff, he had done more damage than simply injure his arm. His entire leg had been badly damaged.
"A voice I'll never forget,"
he said as he walked. There was something strange in the way he spoke, something sad and quiet, or possibly even a quiet anger. He also could barely look at Barrett as he walked forward, and his mouth was slowly stretching into an uncomfortable, manic grin. Cloud, watching from the back, suddenly got the impression that as well as losing his arm and most use of his leg, Dine had also lost most of his mind.
"I always hoped I'd be able to see you again someday,"
Barrett said, trying his hardest to sound normal and open, as though he couldn't see Dine's slightly unstable state of mind.
"I knew you were alive somewhere. We had the same operation. Listen to me, Dine. I want to."
He stopped suddenly as Dine lifted his own gun arm and fired a single round right at Barrett's feet. Barrett stood frozen as the bullet recoiled off the ground and into the nearby wall, sounding with a metal clang. For the first time Barrett saw the manic expression on Dine's face, and realized that Dine was nothing like he used to be. Too much had happened. He watched as Dine suddenly looked up at the sky, his eyes softening just a little.
What's that? I hear her voice.
Asked Barrett, sounding confused. The manic grin on Dine's face softened for a moment as he looked at the sky.
I hear her voice, Eleanor's voice,
he said. He closed his eyes for a moment as though listening, before he looked back down and pointed his gun arm at Barrett.
Begging me not to hate your rotten guts. That's why I didn't hunt you down. I know I was stupid,
Barrett said, interrupting him.
I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. But what are you doing in a place like this? Why you wanna kill those that ain't even involved? Why?
Dine stared, his eyes flaring up in anger.
Why?
He cried, outraged. He continued to hold out his left arm, which was shaking in the sheer anger that was rising inside as he looked at Barrett.
The hell you care for? Are the people killed going to understand why? Are the people of Corel going to understand just hearing Shinra's excuses? I don't care what the reason is. All they give us is artillery and stupid excuses. What's left is a world of despair and emptiness.
Barrett lowered his head and looked at the ground. He mumbled. It was clear that Dine was in a lot of pain, and a simple sorry was not going to change any of that. He didn't know what to say to him to make anything better.
You still want to hear why?
Dine asked suddenly, and Barrett looked up.
Alright, I'll tell you. 'Cause I want to destroy everything.
He pointed his gun arm away from Barrett and shot a nearby broken car, the bullet sticking in its already dented surface.
The people of this city.
He pointed his arm the other way and shot the fence again.
This city itself.
He suddenly pointed his arm forward and shot 3 rounds at Barrett's feet. Each time Barrett felt the hot recoil of the bullets near his boots and flinched, but he didn't step back. He didn't believe Dine wanted to hurt him.
This whole world,
Dine finished, lowering his arm. He turned around, wincing in pain as he put weight on his scarred leg, and wouldn't look at them.
I got nothing left in this world. Corel, Eleanor. Marlene.
Barrett suddenly stopped as he realized. He looked up at Dine.
Dine,
he said, a glimmer of hope shining in his eyes.
Marlene. Marlene's still alive.
He heard Dine gasp as his breath stopped short. Slowly but surely Dine turned his head and looked at Barrett properly for the very first time, his eyes seeming awake and open for the first time in a long time. He breathed.
I went back into town,
Barrett said, taking a step forward. He finally felt as though he had found the one thing that would make Dine listen to him. Dine's daughter, Marlene.
I thought she was gone for sure. That is why I wanted to be by her side till the end. That's when I found her. Found Marlene.
Dine stared at him, his eyes widened. He couldn't say anything, even though his mouth moved as though he was trying to say something.
She's in Midgar,
Barrett continued.
Let's go see her together, all right?
He looked at Dine hopefully, until Dine slowly turned away. Dine could feel his heart pounding heavily inside his chest, the first time he had felt it in a long time. He closed his eyes and listened carefully to the strange little voice that was talking silently in his head. Finally Dine nodded slowly, and took in a breath.
So? She's still alive?
He said. His voice was trembling slightly.
All right, Barrett. I guess that means you and I gotta fight.
Barrett jumped back in shock.
What?
He exclaimed. Dine turned around to face him, ignoring the pain of his leg.
Eleanor's all alone by herself,
he said.
I've got to take Marlene to her.
Barrett shook his head in disbelief, unable to believe what Dine was suggesting.
Dine? Are you insane?
He cried.
Marlene wants to see her mom, don't she?
Before Barrett could even think of an answer, he lifted his gun arm and fired at Barrett's feet. Barrett almost jumped back, startled, but he knew that Dine was prompting him to fight him.
Stop, Dine.
Barrett pleaded with his friend.
I can't die yet.
Dine did stop, but only long enough to say,
oh yeah? Well, my life's been over since then.
He began to fire again, and this time he wouldn't stop, the manic, hysterical smile wide on his face.
Stop it!
called Barrett.
I don't want to fight you. Barrett!
Came Cloud's voice from behind him. Barrett turned in time to see Cloud running forward, ready to draw his sword.
Cloud, you stay the hell out of it!
He snapped back fiercely, forcing Cloud to stop.
This is my problem.
Cloud stopped and slowly relaxed his grip on his sword, but he did not let go of it. It may be Barrett's problem, but he was not going to stand by while Barrett got himself hurt or even killed. But none of that crossed Barrett's mind as he turned back and faced Dine, who had finally stopped firing his gun and was looking at Barrett with a look that he had never seen before. It was probably the same look he had had when he killed all the people in the battle square. And this time, it was aimed directly at Barrett. End of chapter. Episode 44, Part 04, Chapter 44. Chapter 44. All hell seemed to break loose as the fight started. Dine and Barrett, both experienced fighters, fought unlike anything Cloud and Red 13 had seen before. It was a terrible thing to watch two former friends fight. On the one hand there was Dine, filled with the hatred and rage that had been burning up inside him for the last 4 years. Although originally that hatred had been aimed at Shinra and what they did to him, over time the anger had turned outwards to a complete, out-of-control hatred of everything and everyone. Even his former best friend. On the other hand there was Barrett. Like Dine, Barrett had also been betrayed by the Shinra and had a lot of anger and hatred towards them and wanted to destroy them as much as Dine did. The only difference was that it was not his anger for Shinra that was fueling him to fight Dine. It was his love for little Marlene that prompted him to fight. He could not let Dine take her if he intended to kill her. Marlene may be Dine's daughter, but it would be Barrett who would fight for her life. Safe behind the piles of crates and run-down machinery, Cloud and Red 13 watched the battle go on. From where they were hiding they were safe from the bullets that were whizzing around missing their targets, or the occasional ram of objects thrown as Barrett tried to get close to Dine and stop him. Despite his frail-looking frame, Dine was incredibly strong, his strength coming from his own anger and fueling him up.
Cloud, we can't just sit and watch,
Red 13 protested suddenly, turning to Cloud.
What if Dine kills him?
Cloud had already turned away from the fight, his eyes shut as though he was sleeping, blocking out the sounds of the fight. He knew very well what could happen in this fight. Dine could kill Barrett, or Barrett could kill Dine. Either way wouldn't matter to Dine, he figured. Still.
This is Barrett's fight,
he replied simply, not opening his eyes. He said no more and simply lowered his head a little. Red 13 stared, but noticed that Cloud still kept one hand firmly around the handle of his sword. A small smile spread on the hound's face as he realized that Cloud wasn't being entirely truthful, and turned back to the fight. Barrett had finally managed to get close to Dine, and was in the process of working a large chunk of metal from his hands, which he had intended to throw at Barrett. Despite his anger-fueled strength, Dine was not stronger than Barrett, and it wasn't long before the metal crashed to the floor out of harm's way. The fight then turned into a fistfight. Too close to use their gun arms without the risk of recoil, the two men began to kick and punch each other as they scuffled, trying to throw the other to the ground. They were getting dangerously close to the edge of the ledge as well, towards the dark chasm. Red 13 continued to watch nervously as the fight continued, his twitching tail a sign of his constant anxiety. He wondered whether he should jump in now and stop the fight, but how could he when Dine was in such a frenzied rage? Luckily, he didn't have to wait too long for the fight to end. Dirty and bloody and increasingly tired from the fighting, Dine was beginning to falter, his grip weakening. Seeing his chance, Barrett delivered one last, hard punch and knocked Dine to the ground. The fight was over. Red 13 barked to Cloud, who turned around and looked out at the scene. Dine was lying back on the floor, breathing hard, blood pouring slowly from wounds on nose and mouth, and the faint signs of many bruises that would form quickly. Barrett stood a meter away, also panting but still standing, looking relieved that the fight was finally over. As Cloud and Red 13 stepped out from behind the crates, Dine began to push himself up off the ground.
Ugh!
He groaned as he felt the pain from a dislocated shoulder, pressing his hands on the ground. He heard footsteps as Barrett began to run to him to help him, but quickly thrust out a hand and shouted, "Back!" Barrett stopped, sweat pouring from his body. He watched as Dine slowly stood up, wincing further as he applied pressure to his injured shoulder, and climbed to his feet. His balance was precarious and shaky, looking as though his legs would give way at any second. He barely managed to stagger over to the broken fence nearby, and leaned against it, letting his injured arm hang limp beside him.
It wasn't just my arm.
Back then, he said softly, his voice low. All the anger had been drained out of him now, leaving him appearing much weaker. He wiped his forehead with his one good hand, and wasn't surprised to find a light trickle of blood from a slight wound on his head. He stared at the blood blankly as he said,
I lost something irreplaceable. I don't know where I went wrong. Dine. I don't know either, man,
said Barrett.
Is this the only way we can resolve this? I told you,
Dine said without a single hint of harshness. It looked as though all the anger that had fueled him up and made him seem stronger had been vented. Now, without that anger, he looked much more tired, frail, and very pale.
I want to destroy everything. Everything. This crazy world. Even me.
Barrett shook his head, trying to meet Dine's gaze.
And what about Marlene?
He demanded, his patience growing a little thin.
What's gonna happen to her?
Ahead of him, Dine sighed heavily. He closed his eyes for a moment to recollect his only memories of Marlene, a cute little baby resting in his wife's arms. Then the painful memories of all that being taken from him in the fire.
Think about it, Barrett,
he began.
How old was Marlene back then? Even if I did go to her now, she wouldn't even know me. And what's more, Barrett.
He looked down at his hand and gun arm.
These hands are a little too stained to carry Marlene anymore.
Barrett couldn't say anything. How could he?
Barrett.
Barrett looked up suddenly as an object, glinting brightly as it caught the sunlight, flew through the air towards him. He caught it easily and looked down at it. It was a pendant made of gleaming silver, neatly built into the shape of a heart. It was still glossy even after so many years. Dine had looked after it well. It was attached by small hooks to an equally clean metal chain, and from what Barrett could see, there was some writing engraved on the back of it.
Give that pendant to Marlene,
Dine said. He breathed deeply, his chest aching from the fight.
It was Eleanor's, my wife's, memento.
Barrett looked down at the pendant for a few seconds more, before he looked up at Dine with a look of surprise. He knew what that meant. Dine had no intention of ever seeing Marlene again. After 4 years of being without her true father in her life, it didn't make any difference to Dine that he wouldn't be there now. Accepting that, Barrett nodded.
All right,
he agreed, and slid the pendant carefully into his pocket so it wouldn't fall out and get lost. A faint smile spread on Dine's face and he sighed, seeming relieved, as though a great weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders and let him be free.
Wow,
he whispered, mostly to himself.
Marlene's. Already. 4.
With a sudden burst of energy he pushed himself up away from the fence. He almost fell over, what with his injured leg and painful shoulder, but he kept his balance and staggered away from the fence, and towards the ledge. He stopped beside the rocky edge and looked straight down into the dark chasm that lay beyond it. He could not see the bottom, but that was all right.
Barrett. Don't ever make Marlene cry. Dine.
Barrett asked confused. Then his eyes widened as he saw Dine turn away from the ledge and spread his arms wide.
Dine.
He dashed forward, hoping to stop Dine before. He was too late. Dine let himself fall back away from the ledge, and disappeared into the chasm. Barrett stopped in horror as he saw his best friend fall again before his eyes. Dine didn't even scream as he fell, for he had already accepted death long ago.
Dine!
Barrett shouted, his voice shaking the crates around them. Deadly silence welcomed his words, and Barrett let himself fall to his knees, shaking almost uncontrollably as he saw his friend fall to his death for the second time. The first had been mental death, the second, true death.
Dine! Me and you were the same,
Barrett said, staring at the floor.
My hands ain't any cleaner. I shouldn't be able to carry Marlene either.
He shook his head vigorously, before he looked up and shouted angrily up to the sky. Not long after, Cloud and the others were all standing in the office of Mr. Coates, the man they had thought was in charge of the desert prison. As it turned out, while Barrett, Cloud and Red 13 were off dealing with Dine, Tifa and the others had all gone out to look for a way back up to the gold saucer. After dealing with some tricky prisoners who could do nothing but lie, they had found Mr. Coates's office. He had told them that they needed special permission from the boss in order to get up. And, as it turned out, that boss was Dine. Mr. Coates was still sitting behind his desk as Barrett promptly led the others into the office. He jumped up angrily, about to protest, until he saw the group of 7 all pile into the room with serious and grave expressions on their faces. His face turned a little pale and he sat carefully back down in his seat, his cool executive exterior breaking a little under the pressure of such a large group.
"You want something?"
he asked carefully, looking around at them all. Despite his efforts to make his voice stay steady, it was breaking with the anxiety. Barrett walked forward ahead of the others, and glared at Coates.
"I want to go up,"
he said plainly. A small smile appeared on Coates's face, realizing he had the upper hand. The group may have looked tough, but there was nothing they could do about the rules.
"Like I told you before,"
he said, his voice gaining in confidence.
"You gotta get the boss permission, then win the chocobo." "Dine's got his reasons and can't speak,"
Barrett interrupted.
"So, I got this, instead."
And he thrust out the pendant.
"Yeah, bull,"
Mr. Coates began, until he saw the pendant that was thrust in front of his face. He saw its familiar silver glint and the writing engraved in the metal, and his eyes widened in total astonishment. He adjusted his glasses, quickly wiping the lenses clean, before putting them back on the bridge of his nose and looking once again. It was no fake. That was Dine's pendant. Behind the image of the pendant, Barrett looked at him smugly.
"I want to go up,"
he repeated, the same as before. Coates was still reeling in the shock, a new wave of fear and anxiety filling him as he took in the facts.
Right.
He stammered, his voice losing control.
"Did you kill Dine? You must be. Or you would never be holding that thing."
He sat back heavily in his chair, his fear being replaced by a feeling of relief.
"So Dine's dead. Maybe now, the place'll calm down a little. Dine didn't care who anyone was."
He didn't get to finish his statement, for Barrett was on him like a lion grabbing for prey. He grabbed Coates by the scruff of his collar and lifted him straight up out of his chair, letting it fall on its side in Coates's struggling attempts to break free. No one stopped Barrett, and let him carry on.
"The hell do you know?"
Barrett shouted at him. He wanted to shake the executive until he lost all his senses, but merely being so close to Barrett had already made Coates lose his senses.
I. Right. I mean, no, I don't know anything,"
he said, continuing to stammer in his fear. He caught Barrett's angry glare.
Sorry."
Barrett glared at him for a few seconds more, and then he let go. Coates fell down onto the floor behind his desk, and quickly began to stand up again.
"Then, will you get us outta here?"
asked Cloud, speaking up for the first time. Coates was busy readjusting his chair at that moment.
"Hey?"
he asked, confused. He shook his head briefly as he realized what Cloud was talking about.
"Oh, man, you guys are mistaken. I already told you, there's only one way to get out of here. That's to win the chocobo race, and that's held up there, in the gold saucer. And, only one racer can go up at a time."
His sentence was cut short as Barrett reached forward and grabbed him harshly again, pulling him so close Coates could feel his breath against his face.
"Say what?"
Barrett cried, outraged. Coates tried to shield his face with his hands, terrified.
"No,"
he wailed pathetically. He reminded them all a little of Palmer, the Shinra executive in charge of the space program, and how he had acted when they caught him.
"Really, even if you threaten me? A rule's a rule. I can't change it. If I do, the whole system down here'll get messed up. And I can't do that. Okay. I'll let one of you go up there. After that, he's gotta deal with Dio."
A single nod from Cloud made Barrett release the man, and Coates fell once again to the floor. While he tried to readjust his suit and tie, Barrett turned to Cloud.
"Alright then," he said. "Cloud, you go. We'll wait down here. Hurry up and win that chocobo race, and get us out of here." "Right, Cloud," said Tifa. "We'll be waiting and rooting for you."
Cloud shrugged. He knew there was no point in arguing with the others once they had made up their minds about that. Not that it was a hard choice to make. Red 13 would have difficulty just getting on a chocobo, and Cat certainly didn't have the mobility, even if it was just his cat form. ARAD was probably too heavy to ride a chocobo through the complex racecourse, which left only him, Tifa, Eris or Yuffie. He began to unleash the straps holding his sword to his back. He wouldn't need that to race.
Have you decided?
Coates asked. Cloud finished unhooking his sword and handed it to Tifa, who took it and held it carefully, the sharp tip pointing down.
All you need now is a manager. And register and get a chocobo. Hi. I happened to hear your story,
came a voice from the outside, making Cloud and the others all jump and turn to the doorway, their hands on their weapons. Apart from Cloud, who motioned to move to his sword only to remember that it was no longer on him, but in Tifa's hands. Coates looked up in surprise.
Esther,
he said, blinking. There was a woman standing in the doorway, peering in on them and smiling happily. As she walked into the room, it was clear that she was not a prisoner or any of the prison staff. She was dressed in a rather strange-looking dress, her hair so neatly parted and tied up it almost looked unreal. Her face was also quite heavily plastered in makeup, she almost looked like a doll. It was quite hard to suppress the giggles that were forming in their throats, making them come out in confusing chokes and snorts. Thankfully, none were loud enough for her to hear as she walked in and went straight to Cloud.
I'll be your manager,
the woman said cheerfully, giving him a cheery smile.
Well, I have nothing against it, but...
said Coates, scratching the back of his head.
This is Esther. She may look kind of funny, but there's no better manager in the races.
Esther's smiley face turned into a frown as she glared at Coates angrily, putting her hands on her hips in a stubborn, defying way.
That's so rude,
she said fiercely. She then sighed and looked down at herself, before she turned to Cloud again.
Yeah, well. Nice to meet you, Cloud.
Cloud nodded back in reply, as Coates headed briskly towards the door of the office.
All right then, Cloud,
he said as he walked.
I'll send you up in the elevator. Esther'll fill you in on the details.
Within 5 minutes Cloud and Esther were both standing in the elevator that led out of the prison. As it turned out, the main complex of the prison housed the elevator, close to the pipe where they had all been dropped from the top of the gold saucer. It was a slow lift, and was really just a platform rising up a long tunnel, from the bottom of the tunnel up towards the midsection of the theme park, where Dio had dropped them.
So that's what happened,
Esther said as Cloud finished his story. She turned her gaze to the lift walls, watching the interlocked plates slowly pass by as they rose up.
I'll talk to Dio directly. You just concentrate on the race.
Cloud nodded slowly, thinking that the Chocobo race was enough for him to think about at the time. He was lucky that Esther was the kind of person who was willing to listen, and felt sure that if she explained it to Dio then they would surely be set free. He was still thinking about this when Esther suddenly clicked her fingers, remembering something.
Oh, yeah, getting back to the other thing,
she said to him.
There are many different types of Chocobo jockeys. It's not only for criminals. Some people compete for the fame, some people compete for the money, some only for glory. And then there are people like you. Oh yeah, I'll teach you how to ride a Chocobo. All right,
Cloud replied. Esther folded her arms and thought for a moment. She mumbled thoughtfully.
You can generally move a Chocobo the same way you would move a horse. Gentle digs in the side will tell the Chocobo to move, and soft tugs on the reins indicate which way you want the Chocobo to turn. For example, if you tug the left side of the rein a little, the Chocobo will turn left, and vice versa. If you want the Chocobo to walk, you give it a gentle dig in the side and a slightly harder one will tell it to run. That sort of thing. But it's pretty hard to make the Chocobo run the way you want it to,
she added with a stern tone.
If the Chocobo doesn't like you, it won't listen. You can't really help on this one. But, most of the Chocobos that I'll provide you with are mellow and you should be able to handle them. Now, as for riding the Chocobo, it's also very simple, but complicated as well if you get my meaning. When Chocobos are running they can be very hard to control, and equally hard to maintain balance. That's why you need to make sure you have a steady balance in the middle of the Chocobo's back, holding on to the reins so you won't fall. A Chocobo's speed depends on its stamina. Most of the Chocobos here have been well trained and have well developed stamina. But, if you go faster than a Chocobo can handle, it'll lose stamina really fast. If you do need to go faster, you should tuck your legs as far as you can around the Chocobo's stomach for grip, then lean forward. This is the sign to the Chocobo, and it will run as fast as it can. This is most advisable when you're dashing for the finish line. Of course, your stamina runs are faster, though. There are some bad-tempered chocobos that can't pace themselves and they'll lose their stamina pretty fast. Finally, some advice for the restless: once the first and second chocobo cross the goal line, the race ends there.
Cloud nodded. It all seemed basic enough. Still, he wasn't too confident, despite Esther's cheerful, optimistic smiles. He hadn't even been able to catch a chocobo back on the Choco Plains without the help of the others, and he didn't find his chances of winning too good. Still, with all the others waiting down in the prison for him, he could only try. End of chapter. Episode 45, Part 04, Chapter 45. Chapter 45. After another minute or so of climbing up in the lift, Cloud soon heard the sounds of the gold saucer. First he heard the carnival-like music that came from the attractions, quiet at first but growing louder as the lift rose up, fading again as they went by. Then he heard the screams of cheerful riders from the roller coaster as it sped past, although he couldn't see it. He and Esther didn't say anything else to one another as the lift went up. At first Cloud thought she was just being quiet, until he heard her mumbling quietly to herself. He was beginning to think she was as strange as she looked, but he could just hear her mumbling chocobo statistics to herself, and he realized what she was doing. She was mulling over all the chocobos and jockeys in the races, and considering which chocobo she would give to Cloud for the race. It was another half a minute before the lift finally came to a halt, stopping with only a slight shudder. Esther finally looked up from her mumbling and pushed the button to open the doors. A wave of cool air heavy with the scent of sugar and popcorn wafted into the lift, hitting Cloud so full on that he felt a little bit sick. Along with the smells came the sudden lift of noise and sounds, and Cloud realized just where they were. The lift had opened up right at the entrance to the chocobo races, the lift quite cleverly disguised by the words staff only painted on the door. There was no doubt that no one else knew that the lift went all the way to the bottom of the gold saucer, unless they broke any of Dio's rules. Esther motioned Cloud out of the lift and quickly led him through the crowds of cheering people who were watching the races. She led him towards the back of the square to another staff-only door, and quickly pushed him through before she turned to speak to one of the other members of staff. The door led Cloud straight into the jockey waiting room, where all of the registered chocobo jockeys were currently waiting for the next race to start. There were maybe a dozen registered jockeys in all, but at that moment there were only 5 in the waiting room. The others were all currently racing, hence the sounds of cheers and groans from outside as people either won or lost their bets. Cloud looked around at the group of jockeys, eyeing them over. They were all professionals, dressed in smart and somewhat silly-looking tunics and riding pants, boots and helmets included. 4 of them were sat at a table in the middle of the room, playing cards with one another and enjoying the odd cigarette as they waited for their races to start. There was one other jockey leaning against the nearby wall, a smart-looking jockey with neatly trimmed hair and a rather upper-class expression of smugness on his face, although he didn't look unfriendly. He was the only one who looked at Cloud when he came in, and eyed him over as well.
"You knew?"
he asked of Cloud. His voice also carried the tone of someone from the upper classes. He looked up over Cloud's shoulder as the door behind him opened, and Esther walked into the room, the cheerful smile still on her face.
"Hi, Joe,"
she greeted as she looked at the upper-class jockey.
"Hey, Esther,"
Joe replied, tilting his riding helmet slightly in politeness.
"You're looking pretty as usual."
Cloud noticed Esther's cheeks flush a little as she spoke. "Thanks," she replied. Realizing that she was blushing, she quickly turned to Cloud.
"Let me introduce you, Cloud. This is Joe, one of the top chocobo jockeys." "Nice to meet you, Cloud,"
replied Joe, just as politely. He even took a bow, before he suddenly put 2 and 2 together and looked up at Cloud again.
"If you're with Esther, then..."
Esther nodded, almost proudly.
"Right. He's an up-and-coming jockey,"
she said enthusiastically.
"He's only been down here for a day, and already he made it up here."
That caught the attention of the entire group of jockeys in the room. The 4 jockeys who had been playing cards and only half listening suddenly dropped their cards down onto the table, cigarettes dropping from their mouths and helmets clattering onto the floor.
"What?"
they all exclaimed loudly, and 4 pairs of eyes all gazed upon Cloud. They had encountered a number of prisoners from the desert prison trying to get out before, but never before had a prisoner made it up to the races in just a day. Looking Cloud over, he didn't look like anything special, but he must have done something pretty good to earn such a privilege. Even Joe seemed quite startled.
"Oh, I see,"
he said, sounding just a little bit nervous.
"So what did you do down there?" "Sorry. You're not supposed to ask about the past here."
He readjusted his helmet, which had become tilted when he jumped back after realizing Cloud was a prisoner and not just another jockey.
Pretty interesting,
he commented.
I have a feeling that we'll meet again. Then, until we meet again, Cloud.
With another polite bow and a smile to Esther, Joe then turned away and headed off to the stables to prepare his chocobo for the race. Cloud watched him leave. Joe wasn't at all like he had expected from someone so clearly upper class. He was not at all snooty and stuck up, and quite clearly liked the idea of some new competition.
I'm going to check on the chocobo,
Esther said suddenly, breaking Cloud from his thoughts.
You just wait here for a while.
Then Esther left as well, also going into the stables to prepare the chocobo she had chosen for Cloud. Once Esther was gone, the 4 remaining jockeys returned to their game, ignoring Cloud for the time being. They clearly had no interest in prisoners riding in the races, although they showed no hostility towards him. Cloud felt a little awkward standing in the middle of the room by himself, so he went over to where Joe had been standing before, and leaned against the wall. After a minute or two of waiting, the speaker above the stable door finally crackled into life, and a clear masculine voice spoke through.
The race will start in a few moments. Will the jockeys for the next race, please proceed to the paddock? I repeat.
Cloud watched as the other jockeys put their cards back down onto the table, put out their cigarettes, picked up their riding helmets and headed briskly towards the stables to collect their chocobos. Cloud stayed where he was for a few moments, wondering what he was supposed to do. While he was waiting, his arm slipped off the ledge he was leaning on, and something red and shiny was knocked off and rolled onto the floor. Cloud quickly caught it before it rolled under the table and saw that it was a piece of materia, just lying around. He hadn't seen this piece of materia before, although he had heard of it. The lightning bolts that flashed very faintly inside the red sphere signified that it was Ramu, the god of thunder. Quickly Cloud pocketed it, feeling bad about stealing what could have been someone else's materia, but they needed every bit of help they could get.
Cloud,
came Esther's voice suddenly, and Cloud quickly bolted upright. Esther was standing in the doorway to the stables. Cloud wondered if she had seen him, but when she carried on speaking, he relaxed with the thoughts that she hadn't.
Thanks for waiting. I registered you in the next race. This is a chocobo I prepared myself. He won't lose easily. Oh yeah. You know how to ride one?
Cloud nodded.
Yeah, I got it. Then, good luck.
It was very stuffy in the racing arena, Cloud noticed. The square had been open since morning and had already seen many races already. The stench of chocobos and sweat filled the air, but that was only because they were all huddled together. It would soon disperse once the race started. Esther had certainly provided him with a good chocobo, a yellow chocobo named Amy, born and raised in the chocobo stables. She was a young but very healthy chocobo, with a sleek coat of fur and feathers and bright brown eyes. She was also very energetic, which made Cloud wonder if she would use up all her stamina before the race could end. Still, he trusted Esther's opinion. Joe was also in the race, and gave Cloud a wink as he entered the arena with Amy. His chocobo, Grey, was a white chocobo with neatly trimmed feathers and sharp, focused eyes that eagerly looked at the racecourse, stamping its feet down impatiently. Cloud tried to ignore the intimidating looks of the other jockeys and promptly climbed onto Amy's back, holding onto the reins as he waited for the race to start. At that moment the lights signaling the beginning of the race began to flash, and all of the jockeys prepared to launch their chocobos into a quick, sudden dash to get them a good position at the start. Then, when the last light turned green, the race began. The jockeys all set off, pushing their chocobos forward in a quick, sudden dash past the starting line and through the short tunnel that was shaped like a mog's mouth. Cloud ran with them, startled by the sudden rush of exhilaration that came with the thrill of a race. As they passed through the Mogmouth tunnel and onto the blue path that quickly turned into a rainbow-colored tunnel, the jockeys finally pulled back on the reins and forced their chocobos to slow down a little, using just enough stamina to break ahead. Now they were more spaced out and not so cramped together, and that was when the true race began. Cloud found himself in third place when he pulled on Amy's reins and forced her to slow down. He could feel her resistance to his commands as she tried to continue dashing forward, but Cloud could not afford to use up all her energy before they were near the end. Eventually Amy complied and slowed down, but he could still feel her urge to run fast and move past the other racers. He was not surprised to see Joel leading the race as they moved out of the rainbow tunnel and into the patch of grass and forest, a single red sign with a yellow arrow pointing them round to the right slightly where the rest of the racecourse was waiting for them. Joe's chocobo had been bred specifically for riding, and with a perfect pace and speed, it looked like it was going to be a tough challenge for Cloud to pass him. One thing Cloud noticed as they progressed steadily through the racecourse was just how strange and different every single area was. First had been the Mog Tunnel and its blue path, and then into a short rainbow tunnel with its multicolored walls and floors, so perfectly painted they looked natural, and now they were running on grass. It was not real grass, for Cloud could see the faint signs of dark blue-black of rubber that held the artificial grass up, but it was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. The rubber was also helping the chocobos move along through the racecourse. With each slam of their clawed feet against the floor, it seemed to propel them along, giving them extra bursts of speed that wouldn't use up their stamina. Although Cloud was unaware of the position of the other three riders, he could see Joe and the second-place jockey right ahead of him, and Amy's desire to speed up and pass them. Cloud was having the same feeling, but he knew he had to keep the chocobo under his control if he was going to have any chance of winning and getting out of the gold saucer. Following the grassy path area came another area that was again distinctly different from the previous areas. The new area had a floor that was like a chessboard, covered in black and white squares that ran on and on ahead of them before curving sharply to the right. Cloud saw Joe push his chocobo a little harder and swerve slightly to the right as he approached the turn, wanting to get close to the wall before the chocobo ran round and swerved towards the far wall. Cloud figured he ought to do the same, and quickly made Amy swerve towards the near wall. It was a lucky thing for Cloud that he did do it right then, for the jockey in front of him swerved just a little too late, so that when he reached the corner and ran round, his chocobo moved dangerously close to the wall. The realization of that and a quick flash of panic caused him to tug harshly on his chocobo's reins, and the chocobo staggered and nearly fell over. This mistake caused him to stop as Cloud sailed past on his chocobo, and it was only after another rider passed him that he was able to start again. Cloud didn't look back as he continued to run around the large bend, focused on keeping Amy's agile and energetic body in check and as close to the wall as possible so that he didn't lose control of her. He knew when the bend came to an end, for he saw Joe ahead of him relax his grip on the reins, and his chocobo slowed into a less controlled run. They were now running on an upward slope, heading towards a small wooden bridge with yellow lights shining up on it that would guide them into the next area. Joe was still steadily pulling away from Cloud, and Cloud knew he had to catch up to the rival jockey before he pulled too far ahead, otherwise there would be no way he could win. Now running on a brown track, past a gigantic open oyster shell with a huge shimmering pearl glistening inside, Cloud focused on using a little more of Amy's pent-up energy and speed in order to try and pass Joe and get in the lead of the race. He got the feeling that the racer behind him was getting in fairly close and would pass him if he didn't take a risk on Amy's stamina. As Esther had told him to do, he dug in his heels slightly and leaned slightly forward. He felt Amy's relieved response instantly as she began to run faster, but only until Cloud tugged gently on her reins to tell her that was the speed she needed to go. The young chocobo did as she was told and ran steadily forwards, and they gradually began to catch up on Joe. Turning around into the next area, Cloud was awestruck by the high stone pillars that lined their path, each one tipped with a ball of holographic flames. Even though they were only holograms, Cloud could feel the artificial heat against his skin, but Amy didn't seem to mind it at all. So Cloud kept on leaning forward and pushed her onwards. A flash of light suddenly zipped past Cloud and made him jump. Amy squawked loudly and fluttered her wings a little, just as a second wave of eerie green light fell over her and Cloud. Cloud looked up and saw more holograms floating above the racecourse. Holograms shaped like spaceships, at least two of them, with a number of pointy aerials and domed tops flew overhead, the light coming from the center like some sort of beam that was scanning them over. Cloud kept his hold on the reins as they ran through that area, trying his hardest to keep Amy under control. He was immensely relieved once they passed through into the crystal area, where clumps of blue-shaded crystals bordered the path, and Cloud once again focused on catching up with Joe. Thankfully Joe's chocobo had also been startled by the holographic UFOs and had fallen back a foot or two, making Cloud a little closer to him. Cloud used this to his advantage and began to push Amy in his direction, hoping to pass him on the right before the course swerved around again past a series of showcases containing small black globules. Slowly but surely Amy gained speed and eventually reached the tail end of Joe's chocobo, and was steadily getting closer to being level with them. Joe finally noticed Cloud running up next to him as they passed the showcases and onto a second grassy path, with a log bridge just ahead of them. He smiled at Cloud and gave him a wave as Cloud ran up beside him, clearly enjoying the race more than anything else, and he seemed very impressed that Cloud had managed to catch up with him. Cloud waved back, before something else caught his eye and he turned the other way. They were now crossing the log bridge, and to their right was a holographic waterfall, with the hologram continuing its realism way below them. There was a holographic rider on the waterfall, sitting in a canoe right on the edge. As Cloud ran past, he saw the canoeist turn around sharply and quicken his strokes, trying to break away from the edge before he fell. He failed, however, and he tumbled over the edge and down towards the water. Again, Cloud wondered who had designed such a racecourse, with its different areas and strange designs. He had little time to ponder that, for he and Joe were now coming up to what was most likely one of the final areas of the racecourse. The ground beneath them seemed to disappear until it was just a semi-transparent blue path, and, looking around, it looked as though they were running through space itself. The air around them seemed very dense, and Cloud felt as though it was much harder to move. Amy had ducked her head low and was running almost at an automatic sprint as she ran alongside Joe's chocobo, almost neck and neck, leaving Cloud to gaze at the scenery. Below them was a large moon, obviously not life-size but very realistic. Floating above the path was a huge satellite, and Cloud nearly fell off as he craned his neck back to look at it. He didn't take too long to look around, for they were already coming to the end of the space area, and with Amy pulling just slightly ahead of Joe's chocobo, he had to be prepared for what would be the final sprint. As they passed through the final turn of the space area and broke free, they rapidly picked up speed again, and Cloud realized that Amy was now running full tilt, completely out of his control, towards the finish line ahead. Joe was just a split second behind but was steadily falling back. A quick glance back at his face made Cloud think that he was holding back a little on purpose, which surprised him a little. Still, it made him glad, for now they were in first place and so close to the finish line. The finish line, a beam of green light that ran horizontally from end to end of the racecourse, flashed brightly as Amy passed through it. The echo of loud and happy cheers came through the walls of the racecourse as Cloud pulled harshly on the reins and made Amy skid into a sharp stop. Joe stopped just a second later and instantly jumped off his chocobo, pulling off his helmet as he did. He went straight over to Cloud and shook his hand firmly, just as the last of the racers finally pulled into the finishing area.
Congratulations!
Esther cried happily. She ran over to Cloud as he entered the waiting room and threw her arms around him cheerfully, despite the fact that he was still hot and flustered from the race.
Now you're home free.
She gave Cloud a tight squeeze before she released him and quickly held out an envelope.
Oh yeah, the owner told me to give this letter to you when you won.
Cloud took the envelope and ripped it open, wondering what Dio had written. As he slowly unfolded the letter and looked at the hasty joined-up writing, he hoped that Esther had managed to do what she said she would, and they would all be free. He could feel Esther's eager gaze on him, and so he read the letter aloud. Boy, if you're reading this letter, then you must be E1. And won a victory I'm sure you earned. I heard about Dine from Esther. Now that you are victorious, I promise that you and all your friends will get a full pardon, and you all will be set free. And also, by way of apology, I prepared a little gift for you to use on your journey. Sorry I couldn't be there to tell you this in person, but I am a very busy man. Sincerely, Dio.
A gift?
Cloud asked, looking over at Esther. She didn't reply, but there was a smug smile on her face that made him figure she had something to do with it. He never had the chance to ask her, for a buzzing sound in his pocket made him jump. He quickly pulled out the PHS, which Baird had returned to him before they disembarked from the Shinra ship, and turned it on. Aris's voice came sailing in through the phone, heavy with feelings of excitement and wonder.
Cloud, isn't this great?
Came her voice.
The assistant manager just stopped by and dropped off a buggy for you. Now you can go over deserts and rivers no problem. Okay, Cloud. I'll be waiting outside.
The phone then clicked off, and Cloud could just picture Aris running towards the buggy in her usual state of happiness, eager to take the wheel. Just thinking of that made him shake his head pitifully, his blonde hair shaking in front of his eyes. He looked down at the letter and saw faint marks of writing on the other side. The letter continues. He thought, and turned it over to continue reading. P.S. I just recently met Sephiroth. He must have a lot of fans with boys your age. Why don't you get his autograph? It seems he's headed towards the south of the river, towards Gongaga.
Sephiroth?
Cloud whispered softly. He folded up the letter and placed it carefully back in the envelope. So Sephiroth had been at the Gold Saucer after all. Cloud did wonder how Dio had come to meet him, and even more, how he had got out of it without being killed. But then, from the look of Dio as Cloud remembered, he figured that even Sephiroth would have a hard time getting his sword through those muscles.
I guess this is goodbye,
said Esther, and Cloud looked at her.
Yeah. Well, if you ever get your own race chocobo, come back again. I'll take care of your registration and everything. I'll see you again.
The buggy sure was something, and, as Cloud had expected, Eris was sitting at the wheel with an excited look on her face. She, Tifa and Kat cheered as Cloud walked up, and he tried to ignore their cheers as he climbed up into the back of the buggy, sitting with Kat and Red 13, as Barrett had taken the seat next to Eris. Cloud was also relieved when Tifa handed his sword back to him. Feeling its familiar weight in his hands and the smoothness of the wide, flat blade, it beat holding chocobo reins any day. He put it back where it should be, on the strap behind his back, and sat back in the car.
Where to?
Asked Eris from the driver's seat. Everyone slowly turned to Cloud, waiting for his answer. Cloud stayed silent for a moment, before he finally looked up and said just one word.
Gongaga.
End of Part 4. You have now reached the end of Final Fantasy VII, the story first installment. The story will continue on a separate file titled Final Fantasy VII, the story second installment. Thank you to all of those who have reviewed this first installment and made it a success. I hope you will continue to read as we continue this FAC soon. Coming soon. Final Fantasy VII, the story second installment. Part 5, Study of the Planet. End of chapter. End of book.